She knew, the moment the woman with the tablet squinted and tapped, that the night had a different plan for her. Julia had rehearsed this evening a dozen ways while she tied the ribbon on the dress she never wore to anything more formal than a parent-teacher meeting. The spare invitation had come from Marina. "My boss can't make the gala. Take it, please." The kind of favor friends slip one another when they want to thin the river of their small worries. Julia said yes because it felt possible to be someone else for a few hours, because the sea air smelled like forgiveness in Florianopolis at sunset, and because she wanted, if only for a night, to not be the woman who had spent the last few months relearning how to stand on her own after Felipe left. The hotel ballroom hummed with a steady, polite luxury, strings that softened the edges of conversation, waiters moving like punctuation marks, chandeliers that trapped the last of the sun and let it go slowly. Through the glass, the sea was a low, dark invitation. Julia kept her clutch under her arm and her invitation in her palm like a talisman. She smiled at the hostess as she reached the gate, at the polite nod and the tablet that glowed in the woman's hand. "Name?" the woman asked, voice bland as a form. "Julia Mendez." The woman tapped, the screen answered with a little red exclamation, and the smile she wore thinned into an economy of attention that said, "You are not on the list." Julia felt it before she registered it, the small shift in the room, the way a conversation folded closed like a hand. The woman's finger moved faster, the clipboard whispered protocol. Behind her, a man in a navy suit cleared his throat. Someone else glanced. A whisper threaded through the air. "Who is she?" And with each repetition, Julia felt her edges scrape. "It says Mrs. Castro on the invite," said the tablet woman, not unkind but not wrong either. "If you don't have proper confirmation—" "I don't know what that means," Julia said, too quickly. Her voice came out smaller than she had imagined. "It was Marina's ticket. She told me to come." The tablet woman looked at her with procedures in her eyes. "We can't let people in who aren't on the list." The crowd near the entrance tightened. Faces that had been friendly now had the sharp, careful interest of judges. Julia's breath became a series of small, clumsy things. She could feel heat crawling up her neck, the certainty that whatever color her cheeks took would remain on her for hours, and not in a good way. That's when a voice cut across the airport breeze hush of the lobby, a voice that didn't belong to the small conversations, but slotted into authority like a key. "Release my date." The words were short and plain, not shouted, but they landed with a clarity that displaced the air in front of her. Julia turned. A man stood a few paces away, hands in his pockets, suit unassuming in a room full of ostentation. He was not the kind of presence that demanded attention with flash. Instead, he contained it, as if his posture were an edict. His face was not flashy either, lined a little at the eyes, the kind of handsomeness that had been earned by years rather than given by luck. You could have missed him if you hadn't been watching how he watched things, the careful observation of someone accustomed to noticing structure. The woman with the tablet blinked, then repeated herself a bit louder. "Sir?" "Release my date," the man said again, and there was no weariness in it. It was a sentence like an instruction manual written in a different language, simple, exact, with the inevitable power of a tool put to proper use. Disapproval flickered across a few faces, the sort of expression that had once found flirtation in public slights. The hostess cleared her throat. A manager stepped forward. "We have a protocol." "He's right," Marina said, suddenly at Jules's elbow, chin up. She had arrived moments earlier, cheeks flushed and hair slightly more wild than suits and stages allowed, and she translated panic into defiance. "Juliana's with me. The ticket is in my name. Please." There was a brief movement, a polite negotiation that is always about saving face rather than finding truth. The tablet woman glanced from Marina to the man who had spoken, then to Julia, again, the same set of eyes that insist that rules are more important than people. He reached for his glass as if to steady himself, and then set it down. For a second, everything shrank to the three of them. The woman with the tablet, Marina trying to hold the world together with optimism, and this quiet stranger whose insistence had unclenched the air. He inclined his head toward Júlia as if to introduce himself without words. "Henrique Castilho," he said, the name like a small, simple building, precise, clean lines. He smiled the sort of smile that made Marianne feel that the problem would be handled. "Mr. Castillo," the manager said, deferential, "I'm sorry for any—" "He said it already," Júlia heard herself say, though it felt as if she were watching herself move. The absurdity of being defended, of having someone else insist on her presence as if it were something fragile and valuable. She tried to straighten. "Thank you." Henrique's gaze was on her now, polite but present. "I'll take responsibility," he offered. "She's my date." It was not opulence that steadied the room. It was the ease with which the words sat in some people's mouths, the weight of habit that made them credible. The manager sighed and smiled the smile that let most things slide when a person of a certain place asked. "Of course," he said. "Welcome, Mr. Castillo." And because the way things bend is often to the advantage of those who are patient enough to wait, the doorway cleared. Júlia felt a heat that was not shame so much as a baffled gratitude. Whatever had been on her face, pale, stunned, melted into relief. The room returned around her like a tide. Someone handed her a flute of something composed of bubbles and sugar. She let it rest at the base of her fingers. "Thank you," she told Enrique, as they moved away from the tablet and the murmurs like loose paper. Her voice wanted to be smaller now. She meant to be small, apologetic, grateful. He waved away elaborate thanks. "It's no trouble." He offered a hand, his not gloved in any theatrical way, simply the steadiness of a human palm. "Enrique." "Júlia," she said. The name felt anchored, not precious. She repeated it to herself like a line from one of the novels she taught. A name is a starting place. They drifted toward a balcony that framed the sea, a sliver of light still caught on the horizon. Beyond the glass, evening laid itself like a clean sheet. The balcony smelled of salt and something sweet from the reception, candied fruit, someone's perfume. The music from inside softened as if the building itself exhaled and let them have a private chord. Enrique leaned against the railing, the city falling away below them, the sound of waves an honest counterpoint to the polished chords. He was quick with a question that was not invasive. "Are you from Florianopolis?" "No," Júlia said. "I live here. I grew up not far, near Lago da Conceição." She pronounced the words with the unself-conscious grammar of someone who teaches language and loves the way phrases look on a page. "I teach literature at a municipal school. Machado de Assis used to make my students laugh in a strange way." She forgot for a moment that the confession was clumsy, that she had a tendency to defend what she loved, even when the world was not asking. Enrique's expression tightened in an unmistakable but quiet way. It was a shift she would later learn the cause of, the long memory that people with losses often carry. "Machado de Assis," Enrique repeated, the name careful as one repeats the name of a beloved relative. "He writes like he's setting a trap for the reader and then apologizing for it." Júlia laughed, a small sound like a bell. "Exactly. My students call him sneaky. I tell them he's honest. He simply knows people." They stood in the soft light and listened to the sea. Enrique's watch caught the glow. He pushed his sleeve back a fraction to check the time, an ordinary action that felt intimate. The ring on his hand shone too, a careful circle, and instinct made her study it. It was not jewelry as statement. It was memory worn like a habit. "Can I ask something selfish?" Enrique said, and there was a tilt of humor in his voice that gave the moment its softness. "Why did you come tonight if Marina hadn't asked?" Júlia turned that question over like a page. Silences had become familiar to her lately. She was learning they were sometimes big enough to hold a truth. Because I needed to see people who weren't waiting for me to be small, she said finally. It wasn't a flourish, it was honest. To see that life goes on among strangers. He absorbed that, the kind of man who seemed to value the architecture of small things, the way a sentence is built, the way a room is arranged to do what it's meant to do. Do you teach them to read other things besides Machado? He asked. Love poems, she said, because they like to read aloud, and the rest of literature is quieter. And sometimes we read Guimarães Rosa for the words. The fresh words feel like a surprise. She felt the assurance of being in her element, that particular glow of someone who loves their work. Children recognize the music in language. They notice metaphors like they notice sugar in coffee. Enrique nodded like someone cataloging something precious. My work has less music, more lines, he said. I'm an architect. I study how things support themselves. He paused, and sometimes when a person builds a house, they end up placing a memory where the light is best. She glanced at him. Are you building something now? He said, understated. A small project, a renovation on the North Shore. The clients wanted to keep the old bones. I like that, work that listens to what's already there. His hands moved, considerate, as if sketching invisible beams in the air. There was a humility in the way he spoke about his wealth. It wasn't announced, only implied in the carefulness of his language and the absence of boast. They moved back inside because the room's warmth and the string quartet's melody tugged them back. A server offered them a plate of tiny pastries. Júlia accepted one, even though she had no appetite. The music shifted to a slow jazz standard, the kind that curses loneliness with tenderness. Dance? Enrique asked, and it was a question soft as a hand extended. Júlia almost said no, because she had forgotten how to let her body follow the music, but then she thought of Marina's smile at the entrance, pressing a ticket into a friend's hand like a dare, and she let herself be led. He held her with an ease that suggested he had worked with physical space his whole life, how to move through it, where to rest. The dance was not a performance, it was a small agreement to synchronize breath. The chandeliers bent light around them, and for a moment the room had only 2 people in it. She felt, beneath the dress and the polite posture, a looseness at the base of her ribs, as if something small and trapped had been allowed to breathe. You were humiliated, Enrique said softly as the band softened its tempo. He did not accuse, he acknowledged the fact, the part of reality that hung on the edge of the evening. I was, she admitted, and then you told them to let me in. She tried to make it lighter than it was, which was very brave. He smiled with a half-laugh. Bravery is relative. Sometimes it's simply noticing that someone's embarrassment is unnecessary. She wanted to ask why he had stood up for her, but the question felt greedy and absurd. Instead, she said, "Why did you come tonight?" "For the opening," he said. "I've been shortened by meetings lately. I should have been at the site, but I like this neighborhood, and I like to see when a building lives up to what was promised." He watched her with an attention that felt like a generous lamp. "And you?" he asked, quick as a sentence. "Do you like the architecture here?" "I like the old balconies," she said. "They tell stories about who was once allowed to look out and who was meant to be seen." The jazz took the edges off her sentences and made the words easy to give away. They talked like that, small revelations folded in politeness, until the night felt like a confession. Once, when a pause threatened to become awkward, Júlia mentioned her students, Gabriel in particular, a boy who loved Clarice Lispector and read passages with the devotion of someone finding a map in the margins. Enrique brightened at the name, as if that was a building material he knew how to use. "Bring him to the gallery," he said before he thought.
I'd like to meet a reader like that. She found herself saying yes without a plan, because the idea of someone noticing Gabrielle's devotion in a quiet room felt like justice. He'll be thrilled, she promised. Dinner followed the dance like a natural continuation. They sat at a small table not far from the orchestra, plates arranged with the precision of places set for rituals. Enrique listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, the sentences were measured. He asked about her work, about the public school, about the books that kept her awake at night. He admitted that Laura, his late wife, had once loved to sit in old bookstores. She thought that books smelled like a place you could hide in, he said. And the way he said her name made it clear Laura was not a ghost to be banished, but a weather that sometimes passed through the rooms of his life. Júlia felt a curving of sympathy that was not pity. There is a particular tenderness, she knew from Garrido's poetry and from afternoon conversations with students, that grows from recognizing another person's ache without making it yours to heal. She found herself telling him something she had not planned to say that night, about Felipe, about how the small betrayals and the final plate of excuses had left her raw. Felipe had been the sort of boyfriend who turned a life into a wish list and then disappeared when the boxes arrived. She had been left to unpack the pieces and decide which were hers and which belonged to a shared dream that had never fit. He listened. At a certain point he reached across the table and placed his hand over hers, not in a gesture of possession, but in one of assurance, that whatever their briefness, he would be there for the moment. The touch was shy and deliberate, a small bridge. "You teach them how to read the world," he said at one moment, not as an observation, but as a recognition. "That's an architecture of its own." She smiled.
"I try." After dinner, they walked along the marina. The night air had cooled. The sea smelled of salt and diesel, and the kind of permanence that comes with tides. Boats leaned like sleeping animals. The city's lights stitched patterns across the water. Enrique's profile was a silhouette against the lamplight, and she watched the way he spoke into the air, as if shaping sentences into structures. He spoke of small restorations he had done, an old house where a family had kept a single photograph of the grandmother in the hallway, a church whose stained glass was mended not by replacing, but by repairing what remained. "Why repair?" Júlia asked. "Why not start anew?" "Because new erases what gave place its memory," Enrique said, "and memory can be an ally. It can teach you where not to put a wall." He looked at her then, as if testing whether she agreed. If you're building a life, you need to know which parts were always meant to stay. She thought of Felipe, and of the rooms she had moved out of, the way someone else's mismatched cups could feel like a home invasion. She thought of the classroom, with its crooked blackboard, and students who believed metaphors were secret doors. "Sometimes you have to take down a wall," she said, "but not always. Sometimes you learn to open a window." They sat on a bench near the water, and the conversation softened into the kind of silence that is companionable. Enrique seemed to understand that not every lull needed to be filled. Instead, he hummed a little of a song she couldn't place. It was domestic and oddly comforting, like the memory of a kettle boiling. When it was nearly midnight, he offered to drive her home. The car smelled of leather and citrus. She watched him drive with an odd intimacy, hands on the wheel in a way that suggested habitual competence, the quiet concentration of someone who liked to make things precise. When she thought of architecture, she had only imagined it as buildings. Now she saw it in gestures, how a man steered not just a vehicle, but also a conversation, balancing speed and caution. They stopped by the beach, where the water reclaimed the shore in small, steady breaths. The moon was a pale coin in the sky. He turned to her and said simply, "May I walk with you for a while?" They walked along the damp sand, and the sea wrote transient notes at their feet. The talk dropped to more personal cartography. Enrique spoke of Laura as if she were a house he had once loved. He said, "She loved small things, and she had a way of making strangers feel like guests." His voice was even. It did not sound like someone trying to persuade himself. It sounded like someone telling the truth. "Was she your first?" Júlia asked.
because she was curious, and because curiosity has a way of seeking a map when one is lost. "Yes," he said. "We married young. We learned how to build a life together. Small, honest things. She died 2 years ago." The words were crisp as winter. They recessed into the night with reluctance. Julia felt at once the odd unfairness of grief, a thing so private standing naked in the moonlight, and the absurd gratitude for his candor. "I'm sorry," she said. "Thank you." He shifted a little closer. "You were hurt recently too, you said." "Yes." She named Felipe's absence, a negotiation that turned into a leaving. "It was sudden in the way that things become definite. One day we were planning a trip, and the next the trip was only his plan." Henrique listened and then laughed softly, the kind of laugh that includes a shake of the head for the small human absurdities. "We both have chapters torn out by different hands," he said, "and yet here we are, standing on the edge of the ocean, as if the tide might rewrite our sentences." The moonlight made his features a charcoal sketch. She could see the line of his jaw and the way his eyes caught starlight. There was a pause, an actual held pause, where both of them measured the distance of what might be allowed. He reached, again not to claim, but to connect, a hand at the small of her back that was careful, asking for permission to remain. She turned to face him. The air was full of salt and the softness of the night. When their mouths met, it was not the urgency of a rescue. It was deliberate and patient, a kiss that said, "We are consenting to this small, fragile thing of proximity." It closed the space between them gently and did not pretend to fix everything. When they parted, the world was still there, unchanged, but something in her chest had rearranged into a more livable shape. They lingered on the sand, as if reluctant to end a chapter they had just opened. Henrique studied the ring on his hand, not as if it were an indictment, but as a fact that required reckoning. He did not speak of removal. He did not make pronouncements about the future. He tucked his hand into his pocket and offered his arm with domestic, careful gravity. "Will you—" Julia began, then stopped. The question was amorphous and too big for the moment. "Will you come by the school sometime?" she finished instead. The thought of him meeting her students made her nervous in a way the Gala never had. "I'd like that," he said. "I enjoy seeing where people grow, architecture of people." He smiled at his own phrasing, as if metaphor could be polite in public. They said good night under the same lamplight that had witnessed their first unpretentious truce against loneliness. Julia walked the few blocks to her apartment with the lingering scent of his cologne and the echo of his laugh in her ears. The city at that hour felt like a book with a bookmark, a story paused. When she inserted her key into the lock, an old brass key that had both physical and symbolic familiarity, she noticed the small text notification on her phone. It was a forwarded message from Marina. "Did the Millionaire hold the line? I'm dying." Julia smiled and typed back a single line. "He did. I'm home." She put the message aside and found herself pausing at her bookshelf before she even took off her coat. Her classroom's worn copies of Machado, Clarice, for the students who liked the bite of language, and Guimarães of Rosa, books that had kept her mind tidy when feelings were messy, seemed at the moment to form a small wall of witnesses. She ran a thumb along a spine and felt oriented in the way people feel when they touch their own history. On the table by the lamp, she noticed an unfamiliar business card tucked under a coaster. It had been slipped there, small and deliberate. Henrique's name was on it, in an elegant type that matched his sentence-shaped presence. Beneath it, in smaller script, an invitation. "If you ever need anything, call me. H.C." Her chest tightened in a way that resembled both possibility and caution. She placed the card on top of a book and closed the cover gently, as if what lay beneath might rearrange its own order. She texted Marina back a long joke about being rescued.
because laughter is easier when it's shared. Then she sat at the edge of her bed and watched the city light thrum through the curtains. The evening had not resolved any of the profound things that pushed at her. Felipe's absence, the hollow place grief had carved into Henrique's life, but it had threaded a new, small line into the fabric, a name, a number, a possibility. She did not sleep well. When sleep finally came, it came in bursts, the kind that leaves you with an impression rather than a memory. In the morning, sunlight would make the room too honest, and she would return to her ledger of tasks, correcting essays, planning classes, answering Maria's question about metaphors. But somewhere, between herd of routine and the scatter of everyday life, there was now a small private shift. A man in a gray suit had said 3 simple words and changed the arc of a night. He had said them without fanfare and with a kind of grounded conviction that made the world tilt toward curiosity. Standing at her classroom door the next day, Júlia watched her students file in. Gabriel waved her over with the page of his book folded, face animated like someone who'd found a key. The rest of the room buzzed with the usual fervor of adolescent certainty. She felt, for the first time in months, a quiet anticipation that wasn't about the outcome of graded essays. It hummed like a note held steady in a chord. Henrique's card sat in the back of her mind the way a bookmark sits between pages, a promise to be discovered again. A bell rang. The day unrolled. She stepped to the front of the class, let the light fall on her hair, and began to read. The students listened, and for a little while, everything that had nearly embarrassed her the night before was reduced to the short, eloquent truth that literature helps you put words to a shape you didn't know you were making.
Later, when the school's conservatism about visits and civility met Enrique's inclination for discretion, he surprised her by showing up at a gallery opening that week, no fanfare, simply present, an observer who loved to watch how people used spaces. He stayed at the edge of the room, leaning casually against a pillar, like an element that had always been structurally sound. When she noticed him, he nodded and smiled, a small greeting that acknowledged their continuing sentence. The days that followed did not unspool into a cinematic sweep. They were composed of messages exchanged in the space between commitments, lunches at corner cafes, and a quiet offer from Enrique to help with a classroom reading project, which he did without splashing money or unnecessary spectacle. He brought in a collection of old architectural sketches that illustrated the way a building could tell a story, and Gabrielle read a favorite passage with a solemn joy that made Enrique laugh with real pleasure. There were small tests, too, not drama so much as the ordinary friction of 2 lives learning to be a duet. Felipe's name surfaced once in a message, an accidental, indifferent echo, and Júlia felt a quick shudder in her chest that was startling in its betrayal. Enrique noticed, as he noticed the small marks of life, and he did the thing he had done all night at the gala. He simply listened. But there was an undercurrent neither of them spoke about at length yet, Enrique's ring. It sat on his finger through coffees and gallery openings, through the way he reached for a pastry near the counter, through the time he adjusted the collar of his shirt. It was not a thing that demanded conversation. It was a quiet presence that required acknowledgement. Júlia noted it because she was learning a new lesson about the shape of care. One does not assume removal is the cure. She watched him with the same discretion he had shown her. When they walked together along the old streets near Santo Antonio de Lisboa, the evening laying itself in comfortable shadows, Enrique stopped in front of an old house he had once worked on and traced a line in the air as if speaking to the memory of a wall. "You see how this window is a little askew," he said. "People complained, but I think it gives the room a certain generosity. It allows light to fall in an unexpected way." "You keep apologizing for your houses," said Júlia, smiling.
Maybe I apologize because I respect that every house has been loved before. It's not mine to fix overnight." She liked that answer. It fit the man who had told the doorman to let her stay, not a rescuer with a ledger, but someone who honored what had been and wanted to make the next thing a little kinder. That night, as she placed Enrique's business card back on her table, she felt an ache that was not the same as when she had woken from nights of solitude.
It was a tender, watchful feeling, one that included the knowledge that people carry their pasts as much as their names. She closed her eyes and let the image of the sea be the place where possibilities washed up and then receded. There would be more conversations, tests, and small gestures to come. There would be moments when grief and hope sat on adjacent benches and neither claimed the other. She turned off the lamp and listened. The city breathed. On the balcony of that night already past, the ocean still performed its slow ritual of acceptance and return. Somewhere in the hush between sleep and waking, she found herself repeating a line from Machado that had always felt true. The world is made by those who attempt to name it. Tonight, someone had spoken her name and refused to let it be shamed. That, she decided, might be the beginning of something she had forgotten how to want. If this kind of gentle, true-to-life romance resonates with you, leave a like. These stories mean as much to the people who tell them as to the ones who listen. The week that followed moved in soft increments, a slow accrual of ordinary moments that added up to something neither of them could have named at once. Mornings were the old rituals. Coffee sipped from chipped mugs, the walk past the mangroves toward the school where Julia taught, the roll call of faces that taught her how to translate patience into grammar. Evenings belonged to new rituals, messages exchanged between errands, short lunches at kiosks by the water, the awkward poetry of two lives learning to coordinate. Henrique was careful in ways that had nothing to do with money. He said please and thank you to the cleaners at the gallery. He remembered Gabriel's favorite passage and asked that same boy, in the hush of a small room, to read it aloud when they visited the exhibition. He brought a small stack of architectural sketches to Julia's class one Tuesday, hand-drawn studies of balconies and staircases made from light, and he let the children handle them, explaining the way a lintel holds itself in patient truth. Gabriel's reverence for words made Henrique grin in an open, surprised way, and for a moment the architect looked like someone discovering a new material to admire. There were dinners with friends when Marina insisted on joining, her laugh a buoy at the edges of conversation. Marina loved to catalyze scenes. She would insist on clinking glasses at the beginning of a story, on arranging a seat near the window so Julia could see the sea. Marina's presence served as a reminder of the life Julia already had. A friend who read her like a favorite book, who knew which page to mark and how to send a text that cut through reluctance. "You look like a person who has remembered how to smile," Marina announced once, half teasing and half committing, and Julia surprised herself by not contradicting her. They moved slowly. There was no feverish declaration, no cinematic rush of vows. Instead, there was a series of modest agreements. Enrique checked in with polite texts before showing up at the school. Julia agreed to meet him for an early morning coffee at a small bakery near Santo Antonio de Lisboa before a gallery event. They sat side by side on a bus one windy afternoon and watched the city tilt past like the pages of a book. Those spaces were not empty of feeling. They were full of the kind of quiet attention that builds trust, showing up, listening when someone is tired, carrying another's umbrella without making it a favor. Work consumed them in different ways. Julia's days were full of small dramas, essays to grade, parents to calm, the delighted surprise when a student discovered a new author.
She found herself recommending Machado de Assis with the same mischievous note she used in class, and when a parent complained that the school should favor more practical texts, she defended literature not with grand words, but with examples: the student who found escape in a paragraph, the teenager who learned to name a feeling and, by naming it, to hold it without being owned by it. Enrique attended an opening on a Thursday evening for a restoration project he'd consulted on, and that night he came to the school's informal reading circle because he'd promised Gabrielle he would. Watching him in the cafeteria, listening to a shy boy read, Julia felt the warmth that comes from watching someone notice the precise places where a person gets bright. There were small missteps, little frictions that two people learn to navigate. Once, after an exhibition, Enrique absent-mindedly reached to tuck a napkin into his suit jacket, and Julia saw the wedding band glinting in the light. It was there at breakfast, at the gallery, at the seaside cafe. They were little shards of a life not altogether gone. He never wore the ring with ostentation. It sat like a punctuation he hadn't yet decided how to close. Julia did not demand explanations. The ring was part of his weather. She learned not to treat it as a cliff to scale, but as a boundary to be respected. Sometimes, when they walked together along the long stretches of Florianopolis, where the city leaned into the ocean, Enrique would talk about Laura in the gentle way one refers to a late friend: precise images, a favorite song, a photograph preserved in a place of honor. He praised the small things she loved, books that smelled like hiding, a certain red kettle, and he told stories that never sought to make her absence less tragic. The grief was there, honest and unadorned, and Enrique's manner of carrying it taught Julia how to be present to someone without trying to repair them. "I think about the scaffolding sometimes," he said to her one afternoon, while they sat on a low wall near Praia Mole, watching surfers move like calligraphy.
After Laura, there was a time when I wanted to erase every unfinished corner, to start again, but I learned that repair is patient. "You don't need to explain," Julia told him. "Talking about her, it's not a burden." He rested his forehead on his knuckles and smiled, a small, private thing. "I'm learning how to hold both things at once," he said, "to remember the good and to make room for new afternoons." The learning required time. Weeks slid by and began to feel like a single braid of evenings and mornings threaded together. There were small, intimate rituals that became part of the pattern. Henrique bringing her a cup of tea when he came by to help organize a reading corner in her classroom. Julia leaving him a note on his car's dash before a morning meeting. They cooked dinner together once, clumsy with unfamiliar recipes. Julia taught Henrique how to make a simple stew her grandmother had shown her, and he, in return, showed her how to choose light for a room, how angle changes a chair's expression, how shadow can be a companion rather than a fault. Then, one night in the middle of late November, a message arrived that unsettled the domestic ease they were building. It was a short, businesslike text from Felipe. He wrote that he was back in town for a week and wondered if they could meet to talk. The message triggered a small, raw place Julia thought had closed. Grief had hardened into a cautious shelf, and the name Felipe always knocked briefly at that door. She stared at the screen for a long moment. The phone in her hand felt heavier than its weight. She told Henrique because withholding such things had become a habit she no longer trusted. He listened the way he listened to other small things, without spectacle, attentive to the shape of her discomfort. "Do you want me to come with you?" he asked. "No," she said. "I don't want an audience. I think I have to do this on my own." He nodded, as if acknowledging a principle in architecture. Some walls must be dismantled from inside. "I'll be nearby," he said. "If you want me, call." She met Felipe for coffee the next afternoon in a neutral cafe near the market.
He was the old familiar weight of disappointment in an easy jacket, still wearing the same smile that had once charmed her into believing in future plans. He talked about mixed signals and about his own bewilderment at how things ended. He suggested gently that they might get back what they had once intended. He spoke as if the past could be reassembled with careful planning. Julia listened, and then, gently and finally, she said no. She explained that their goodbye had already done its work. She had learned to be honest with herself about what she wanted and what she refused to settle for. There was a civility in her calm, an authority that came from experiencing heartbreak and choosing different roads because of it. Felipe did not argue.
He looked unhurt in the way of people who have practiced the relief of walking away. They parted with a goodbye that felt like a full stop, and when she texted Enrique afterward, shortly, a photo of the sea taken from the cafe window, he replied with 3 words that were simply presence: proud of you. But Felipe's message had stirred more than memory. It exposed the tender center where past and present touched. For Júlia, that center required not dramatic gestures, but small, continuous acts of choosing to be present to her students, choosing to accept a dinner invitation even when she was tired, choosing to let herself be seen by someone who had already learned to carry a loss. For Enrique, it meant confronting the ring that belonged to a marriage he had loved. He did not wear it in defiance of moving on. He wore it as if memory were a garment he did not yet know how to fold away. The ring's presence created a question they both felt but had not yet articulated. The question came to a head one bright morning at the North Shore site, where a low, salted wind stitched the scaffolding into a lace of shadow. Enrique had invited Júlia to see a restoration he was overseeing, a modest house on a bluff, windows like patient eyes looking out over the sea. He wanted her to see how he worked with what already existed. He thought she might appreciate the way he treated light and memory. She arrived with a thermos of coffee and a scarf that belonged to her grandmother, which she kept for luck. The crew moved with practiced calm. Men and women passed beams and boards with the attentive choreography of people who trust each other's timing. The house smelled of sawdust and seawater. The air tasted like renovation and possibility. Enrique showed her the rooms, the way a doorway had been preserved rather than widened, the way a window had been turned into a bench that captured morning. He listened to her observations with the concentration of someone who valued her opinion, and in the courtyard they both sat on a low wall, coffee in hand, the sea an unblinking presence beyond. There was a pause. Around them the site hummed with 100 small tasks, and their closeness felt ordinary and true. "I owe you something I haven't given you," Enrique said. He looked at his hands, and there it was, the ring glimmering against the tan of his finger. It was not an accusation, it was a fact he offered into conversation. "I've been thinking about it, not because I think I should be done with remembering, but because I want to be honest with you about the pace at which I am opening a new door." Júlia folded the scarf around her hands as if pulling thought into warmth. "You don't owe me a timeline. You owe yourself kindness." He smiled, a soft, rueful curve. "Kindness is easier when you know where to put it," he replied. "I kept this ring for reasons that have nothing to do with you or anyone I'm with now.
It's a tether to years that made me who I am, but there is a difference between honoring a memory and letting it create a barrier." She watched him then, as if learning the architecture of his courage. His jaw worked in the way it did when he was solving a tricky design problem, evidence, she thought, that grief could be worked through with patience and care rather than brute force. "I'm going to take it off," he said, the sentence modest, deliberate. "Not because I want to pretend there was no life before this one,
but because I want to make this relationship honest work, to choose you without the weight of pretending I had already completed my mourning." The motion was simple. He slid the ring across the finger with an intimate economy of movement. The metal trembled against the light, and for a moment it seemed like the whole yard held its breath. Enrique did not toss it into the grass or brandish it as an emblem. He held it in the palm of his hand, fingers curling around it like someone protecting something fragile. "I will keep it," he said. "I'll keep it in a small box in my study. It won't be hidden as shame. It will be kept as a chapter. Laura was important, and I won't pretend she wasn't. But I want to be clear about the rooms I'm making now. I want you to know that the person next to you is not held back by a secret." Julia felt a strange and tender looseness in her chest, like the moment a knot finally yields. She did not demand an explanation that would stitch the wound closed. Instead, she reached, and of her free hand, brushed the skin where the ring had been. Her touch was small and private, a way to witness the relinquishment without making it spectacle. "That matters," she said. "It matters that you can say it." He put the ring gently into his pocket and stood. The movement was plain, unceremonious. Then he turned to a young worker by the scaffolding and asked him for a hammer, an action that made even the ring removal feel like part of the day's honest labor. The sound of the hammer against wood punctuated the moment, as if to remind them that life was built in pieces. That evening, after the site had emptied and the sky had leaned toward dusk, Enrique walked Julia to her door. He did not press his lips to hers as if to claim the day. Instead, he folded a small object into her hand. It was not a ring, but a key, old brass, worn at the edges, its teeth cut unevenly like a handprint. "A spare," she said, surprised. "I don't—" "It's yours," Enrique interrupted softly. "I would like to be invited in, not assume an entrance. Keep it if you want. Keep it as a sign that I would like to be a part of your rooms, if you'll have me." Julia turned the key over in her palm. It felt heavier than its size, a small talisman of an offer and of trust. She had keys before, keys to classrooms, to cupboards, to the city's library, but this one felt like a promise articulated in brass. She leaned and gave him a quick, luminous smile.
"I'll think about it," she said, because she needed to temper the gift with her own slow rhythm. The weeks that followed were full of small, accumulative proof. Enrique arrived with coffees in the chilly hour before a parent meeting. He did not enter the classroom by force, but was content to stand at the back and listen as she read. He attended a student recital unannounced, and sat with the humble satisfaction of a man who took joy in other people's light. Julia, for her part, invited him into modest corners of her life. A Sunday spent cataloguing the classroom library, a walk through the old bookshop where Laura had once loved to linger, and a quiet afternoon where she read him passages that made her throat catch, watching how his face registered the sentences. The exchange of keys took on ritual. One night, when a storm rattled the city's windows and the weather seemed loud in its demands, Enrique left something at her apartment. A small tin box with a handwritten label, "Tools for the Classroom." Inside were rubber stamps, colored pens, a stack of blank index cards for student prompts. With it lay a note, "For Gabriel and his maps." It felt like a key in itself, the practice of opening. Julia left her spare key in a coffee cup on her kitchen table the next morning. She drove to the school with it in the cup holder, then slipped it into her pocket when she climbed out of the car. She thought of the brass's warmth against her palm that afternoon as she corrected essays and smiled at a child's earnest underlining of metaphors. It was a small, responsible tenderness she could fold into the day. There were tests along the way. People in their circles, well-meaning friends, curious neighbors, asked obvious questions. Marina teased and probed with the friendly malice of someone who loves too well. "So, what are we calling him? Henry? Enrique, the architect of calm?" "He's Enrique," Julia replied, smiling, "and less of an architect of calm than a lover of good windows." Felipe showed up again in her life like a footnote, another polite text that asked questions he should have thought to answer years earlier. Júlia ignored the message for a day, and then finally wrote a concise reply that closed the page with civility. It felt like a decisive draft, short, considered, final. Felipe did not respond. The silence afterward was a kind of mercy. But the more subtle test came from within. There were evenings when Henrique's face would cloud with an absent sadness, and she would feel briefly the old fear that love would always mean compromise with absence. She did not run from that. She met it as she met a difficult passage in a novel, by reading the sentence carefully, by witnessing how it was constructed. On a late afternoon that smelled of winter rain, Henrique invited Júlia to his studio. It was a modest, light-filled room above a bookshop where he kept drawings and models.
He often worked there alone, laying out sketches on a long table and closing a window against the city's sound when he needed to think. Today, the studio felt like a private gallery of their time together. Papers, a folded scarf she recognized, a photograph of a bench he had restored. He had arranged a small tray of tea and 2 cups. They sat in companionable silence for a while, each with a cup between palms. He watched her, eyes soft, and then he reached for his pocket. She thought, momentarily, that the ring might return to the light. Instead, he pulled out a small leather-bound book. "It's Laura's," he said. "I found it in a box, notes she'd made for things she liked. She wrote in the margins, and I thought," he offered it to her, "I thought you might like to see how someone loved a thing." Júlia took the book as if it were fragile. The handwriting inside was a step into another person's habit, intimate and brave. She flipped through pages and found small comments, book titles, notes about a kettle, a shorthand that suggested a life attentive to detail. She felt a sudden, complicated tenderness for Laura. No villainy, just a recorded tenderness. "You keep her close in all the right ways," she said finally. "You don't hide it or make it smaller." Henrique nodded. "I've learned that keeping someone's memory is not an obstacle to loving again. It's a foundation if you don't let it calcify into a prison." He looked at her then, a line of light catching his cheek. "If you ever feel like I'm holding back because I'm still honoring something else, tell me." She touched his hand. "I'll tell you." Her voice had the steady warmth of someone claiming a promise. Time unfurled, and then, inevitably, a more decisive moment arrived. It was the sort of small crisis that life conjures without making a hero of anyone. The city banked a bank of storm clouds, and the Gala season churned in the background. Henrique's team found a structural issue on a property he'd promised to restore in the neighborhood. It was nothing catastrophic, but it required attention and a face at the meeting. He called Júlia that morning, voice small with the responsibility that made his jaw firm. "Come with me?" he asked. She hesitated only a moment before saying yes. They arrived at the site where the client and engineers were gathered across a long table. The air smelled of wet cement and the damp rigidity of professional focus. Henrique led the conversation with a steady hand. He navigated questions and invited clarity rather than defensiveness. At the end of the meeting, the client stood, grateful, and offered them both a polite thanks. On the walk back, rain had started in earnest, thinning the edges of the day into a silver wash. They took shelter under the eaves of a small cafe. Inside, the steam from the coffee felt like the world was a watercolor painting. Henrique laughed at something the barista said, and the laugh landed in the space between them like a small, clean sound. He had kept the ring in his pocket since the day at the site. Now, sitting across from her, with rain on the window, he reached again and touched it. "I meant what I said," he told her. "I want to be clear, and I want to ask you something because it feels right, and because I'd rather be honest than make a spectacle of courage." She leaned forward, the minute tilt that a reader makes when they sense a line is about to resolve. "If I'm choosing to build with you," he said, "are you willing to open a door with me? Not to erase memory, but to make a room that includes both of our pasts." She thought of the classes, Gabrielle's earnest reading, Marina's insistence that she take joy, and the quiet afternoons of cooking and sorting books. She thought of the key in her pocket, the brass that had warmed to the oils of her skin. She nodded, a movement both small and substantial. "Yes," she said, "I am." He smiled the way someone smiles when they hear good news that is not his alone. He reached into his pocket and with a deliberate gentleness eased the ring across his palm and set it on the table between their cups. It was a tender gesture, intimate but not performative. He did not demand theatricality. Instead, with the soft decisiveness of someone who had thought things through, he slid the ring into a little velvet box he had brought in his pocket for reasons he couldn't entirely explain, maybe because decisions often feel better when you have something to physically hold. "I'm not throwing the shape of our histories away," he said. "I'm placing it where I can see it and where it can be honored. I want to come into this fully. If you're willing to accept that, I will not keep one foot in the past as a way to avoid responsibility to the present." The box between them was small, the gesture larger than any one object. Julia reached and took his hand. She did not take the ring. She knew this was his, and she did not need to. The moment itself was the exchange, the ring laid down, the choice to be present declared. In the cafe, the rain wrote small rhythmic verses on the glass, and the barista hummed a quiet song. After that day, there was a new ease between them, not because grief had vanished, but because it had been named and placed. Henrique kept the ring in the study, on a little shelf where he could look at it without being shackled by it. It became a memory archived rather than a chain. They learned again how to build things with care. The exchange of keys happened a week later in a small, earnest ritual. They had spent the afternoon at the restored house on the bluff. The light there was particularly kind, leaving warm smudges on things as if the day insisted on forgiveness. As the sun leaned to the horizon, Henrique walked Julia to her door. He carried, tucked into his coat pocket, a small leather packet. He handed it to her with the guard of someone who respected boundaries. Inside were two things: the same brass key she had given him, now polished and attached to a small tag that read, handwritten in his neat script, "For when you want to come in," and, wrapped in tissue, a small brass key with a different cut, rougher, more utilitarian. Enrique explained. It opened the little studio he used for drawings, the place above the bookshop. He offered it to her not as a claim on some private thing, but as an invitation to share a working room where they could place ideas side by side. "It's yours," he said. "Come whenever you like. I'd enjoy your company when I'm sketching." She laughed quietly. "I'm not much of an architect." "You're a designer of sentences," he replied. "Works with space just as much." She accepted the keys. The action felt like something bigger than the brass itself. It was a way of saying, "I am willing to make room for us in my life." It was his response to the gift she had already given him, the spare key to her apartment. Their exchange was less about property than about mutual welcome. They both left the parcel in a small, deliberate understanding. The keys were symbols of shared trust. From then on, ordinary life draped itself with extra meaning. They spent warm Sundays putting labels on boxes for a small school fair, assembling a makeshift stage where Gabriel gave dramatic readings that made Enrique clap with unreserved delight. They created modest routines, a weekly night to cook together, a Saturday morning where Enrique would bring pastries to the staff room and Julia would bring a stack of poetry to read between meetings. These were not spectacles, but the steady accumulation of kindness. There were moments of insecurity.
Julia sometimes retreated into herself late at night, remembering the way she had once felt compelled to shrink. On those nights, Enrique became the quiet presence of a lamp. He did not fix the past with money or grand declarations. Instead, he learned to sit in the small discomforts, hold space when she needed it, and ask without insisting. His own vulnerabilities surfaced too. He took a risk once when he invited her to visit a small memorial he had arranged for Laura, a bench with a modest plaque near a cliff top where she liked to watch the ocean. He wanted her to see the way memory was preserved, not erased. Julia accepted the invitation. They walked the last stretch hand in hand, not because it was a sign that everything was solved, but because they were learning how to meet complicated emotions alongside each other. At the bench, he read the plaque aloud and then closed his eyes. "I wanted to bring you here so you could see the way she lives in my days, but not to make you feel like a usurper, to show that memory can coexist with new things." Julia sat beside him and watched the sea. "She sounds like she loved well," she said.
Enrique nodded, his face close to being pleased and melancholic at once. "She did, and I will always be grateful. What I hoped for, what I learned painfully, is that gratitude doesn't forbid joy." The months that followed stitched them into the fabric of one another's lives. They moved through the city like a pair of readers who had found the same paragraph and were willing to explore it together. They argued sometimes over small things like whether to repaint a wall in the reading corner or whether a student's suggestion was suitable for the curriculum, but their disagreements landed gently, resolved by the same patient attention that had defined the beginning. The argument itself became a means to know each other more intricately. One crisp Saturday, Enrique organized a small event at the restored house for the community, a reading of letters and an exhibit of photographs and sketches that celebrated the lives people had chosen to keep. Júlia helped select passages and invited students from her class to read. Gabriel prepared a short piece on the architecture of memory, and his reading, nervous but radiant, moved several people to quiet applause. Marina ran a small table of treats and joked with the guests as if she had always belonged there. After the event, while the last of the guests gathered their coats, Enrique pulled Júlia aside. He was quiet, a man who had learned to avoid theatricality. He took her hand and led her to the edge of the garden where the day's light softened into gold. "I wanted to, and I tried to do it without making it a spectacle, but I want to tell you something I should have said months ago. All of this, being with you, sharing small things, inviting you to places that mattered to me, it's been a careful choosing. I choose you." Júlia could feel the world around them settling into a soft focus. The garden smelled like lemon trees and a dry, sun-warmed earth. Tears came to the corners of her eyes, not from sorrow, but from that particular fullness that is the answer to long-thrifted hope. She smiled through the damp. "I choose you too," she said. It was simple. It was true. Around them, the city seemed to listen. He squeezed her hand. "Would you, when you're ready, stay more nights, not as a favor, but as a place you want? I have a small room above the study that could fit an extra pillow and maybe a stack of your books." She considered the image of her books on his shelf, the way his study smelled of paper and lemon, and she felt a practical domestic excitement. "I would like that," she replied. They began arranging the small gestures that made two lives into a tentative household, folding sheets, sorting which cups to use when guests arrived, sharing playlists of music that had become meaningful in their time together. The months did not erase the past. They merely taught both of them how to live with their histories as part of a new architecture. The story did not end with fireworks or proclamations. It ended with the quiet accretion of days where trust was both the plan and the practice. Enrique showing up to hold a microphone while Gabriel read a prize-winning paragraph. Julia teaching a lesson about Clarice Lispector and pausing to watch how one student's eyes widened with recognition. Rowena arranging a small party for their friends, small dinners for two where the conversation fell into easy, companionable arcs. On an evening that trimmed the year toward winter, they walked to the bluff where the restored house caught the last clean light. The sea was calm, the sky a bright, untroubled sheet. They stood with their shoulders close, hands slipping together like two sentences that had learned to rhyme. Enrique reached into his coat and with the same unadorned grace that had defined his choices, took from his pocket the little velvet box. It had been on his study shelf for months, a named memory of Laura's love and of the life he had once lived. "I keep it so I remember," he said softly, placing the box on the bench between them. "Not to make you less important, but because memory is part of the architecture I bring, and I want you to know that I'm building new rooms without tearing down what mattered." Julia rested her head on his shoulder. The box sat there, patient. She thought about the ways love had arrived in her life, a ticket pressed into her hand by a friend, 3 words from a man at a doorway, the slow work of being noticed and of noticing back. She thought about the keys they had exchanged, the brass warmth, the studio door, the small things that made trust visible. They did not promise to know every future. They promised, plainly, to be present in the ones they had. They had learned to hold each other's pasts without letting them become cages. They had learned that kindness and constancy, small gestures and steady presence are the tools that make long-term affection possible. As the sun lowered, Enrique slipped his arm around Julia and said with a hint of the old humor she loved, "Would you like to dance here? No music but the sea." She laughed, and they swayed a little, a careful step for 2 people who had practiced the art of consent and the small courtesies of love. The salt air wrapped around them, the city behind them shimmered and made no demand. They were not rescuers of each other, nor saviors of their own pasts. They were 2 people who had found that being gently brave could hold more truth than any grand gesture. When the night had fully settled, they walked back toward the house, hands linked, the keys jingling softly against each other like a private, happy punctuation. They opened doors not to erase what had been, but to make room for what could still be built. In the hush of the corridor, Enrique paused and pressed his forehead to hers in a small, grateful gesture. "Thank you for staying," she whispered. "And thank you for letting me in," he answered.